Hello and welcome back to my RC channel. I'm AndyRC and today I'm going to be checking out the EMAX Tinyhawk V2. EMAX is another company that have been consistently releasing decent products throughout the year, although I must admit I was surprised to see a V2 of the Tinyhawk so soon after the release of the Tinyhawk S, which came out only about 6 months ago. And it seems like the V2 is an upgrade from that, so let's see what they have changed. The first obvious one is the frame. It's a slightly different shape, but they have also made the struts much thicker than both the V1 and the Tinyhawk S. The V1 struts were quite weak and would eventually break, so on the Tinyhawk S they made the struts wider at the bottom, and on this version they have put double struts in place and then joined them together at the edge of the frame, which is where they kept breaking. The camera housing has changed, so you can adjust its angle to pretty much anything you like. The camera has also been upgraded, which will be welcomed by many. However, I didn't mind the low quality camera on the original because it didn't suffer from any jello, and it was good enough for the situations that I was flying in. They have added the 4x3 version of the Runcam Nano 2, which is a very decent CMOS camera and is going to be great for indoors, but outdoors on a sunny day I think you are going to get some jello due to this flexible frame. They have also added some red LEDs that shine through the frame in low light, and you can't change the colour of them. The bigger camera of course makes the model a tad heavier, with a dry weight of 31 grams against the 28 grams of the original, which doesn't sound that significant, but on 1S combined with the change of motors that they have made means that we might be looking at shorter flight times than the Tinyhawk S, but potentially longer flight times than the original V1. The V1 has 8025 15,000 kV motors, which gave a 3 minute and 40 second flight time indoors on a 1S. The Tinyhawk S has 802 15,500 kV motors, so the stator height was reduced by 0.5 of a millimeter, but the kV was increased, and that gave just under a 5-minute flight time indoors, although both of those times came from flying the models until they would no longer fly, which you should never do, otherwise you would ruin the lipos. The V2 has kept the 802 stator, but the kV has been increased to 16,000, probably to cater for the extra weight, and the props are the same 4-blade propellers that they put on the Tinyhawk S so that turtle mode worked. However, I have since discovered that turtle mode only works with these blades if you are on a surface like carpet. On laminate flooring, or in my case a sports hall, it just slides along the floor using turtle mode, and I don't really recommend flip over after crash, because if a prop gets caught around something, then turtle mode can burn out an ESC from the resistance created from a motor or multiple motors that are unable to spin. So, just like the Tinyhawk S, the V2 comes with the same 450 mA 80 to 160C 1S high volt LiPo, and also a 300 mA 2S high volt LiPo rated from 50 to 100C. Now, I found this surprising because my feedback on the Tinyhawk S was that 2S didn't work with a setup like this due to them using a PH2 connector, which is only rated for 2 amps and in reality can only handle about 10 amps in total. So on 2S the connector caused a huge bottleneck, and the voltage of the LiPo was instantly sagging to battery destroying levels from the get-go, and my advice to them was to at least use solid pin PH2 connectors, which they did do on the Tinyhawk Freestyle, and it did actually make a difference. But they've gone for open pins again here, which is a bit of a head scratcher, because when you couple that up with the higher kV motors and a little bit of extra weight, surely the voltage sag on 2S is going to be ridiculous. After flying the Tinyhawk V1 indoors, almost every week for an entire year at the indoor sports hall club that I'm a member of, I think they fly so much better on a 1S LiPo. So while the 2S option is a nice one to have, if you want to commit to 2S, then you're going to need to solder an XT30 connector to it. Otherwise, I'd be surprised to see the included 2S LiPo last longer than 5 to 10 cycles. Looking at the specs of the all-in-one ESC board and flight controller, it doesn't seem to have changed from the Tinyhawk Freestyle. So the ESCs are BL Heli S set up with D-Shot 600 and are rated to 5 amps each with a low ESR capacitor hidden in the center. The motors have been directly soldered to the board rather than using JST connectors, although the JST connectors are still in place if you need to easily replace a motor. The flight controller is an F4 based off the Maytech Target, and EMAX stresses in the manual that you are not to change any of the Betaflight settings. The model comes tuned and set up ready to go by experienced pilots. However, if you are already an experienced pilot, I'd go against those recommendations. For example, the PID loop frequency is set to 8K 4K out of the box, and an F4 flight controller should be more than capable of 8K 8K, so I changed it to that. RX lost was turned off, and with a model this small, if your transmitter battery dies, then there is no physical buzzer on this model, so I turned that on just in case, although RX set was turned on for a lost model alarm. In stability mode, the angle limit is set to 30, which is very docile for an experienced pilot, and if you are a novice flying outdoors in angle mode, a 30-degree limit might not be enough to fight against windy conditions, so I changed that to 50. And lastly, I lifted the top part of the on-screen display up a level because it was too low for my liking. Now, I have a lot of love for EMAX, but they do like to do a bit of copy and pasting when it comes to their manuals. For example, this one says the version of Betaflight is 4.0x, however it's come flash with version 4.1. They have also included this card, which was supplied with their previous models, stating that on 2S you are to use PID Profile 2 and Rate Profile 2, and PID Profile 1 and Rate Profile 1 is for the 1S LiPo. However, it's set up in Betaflight to automatically switch PID profiles by detecting the input voltage, so there's no need to manually switch PID profiles. And even though the Tinyhawk franchise is aimed at beginner pilots, I've seen many experienced pilots organize races with them. And both Rate Profiles 1 and 2 have a maximum velocity of around 383 degrees per second, and the only difference between the two profiles is that Profile 2 has a 75% throttle limit to try and combat that voltage sag, as well as the lower throttle mid position and different throttle PID attenuation settings. So for the more experienced pilot, 383 degrees of movement is going to feel super docile. So I'll be making a third profile for 2S with stock Betaflight rates and a fourth profile for 1S with stock rates, and then I'll probably leave profiles 1 and 2 standard just in case I run into a beginner who wants to try it out. The receiver is still SPI based and FR Sky only, but there is a spare UART if you want to add your own receiver. The bind button is hard to get to, so I used the CLI command in Betaflight, but because it's flashed with Betaflight 4.1, the syntax has changed, so the command written in the manual won't work for Betaflight 4.1. The bind command is bind_RX and not bind_RX_SPI for version 4.1. The VTX has changed as well. This time it's power switchable up to 200 milliwatts, but just like all other EMAX products, it comes locked to 25 channels and 25 milliwatts out of the box. So if you are allowed to do so, you have to press the button on the VTX while powering up the model, which will unlock the power output and give you access to all 37 channels. The VTX table in Betaflight has also been set up for you, so there's no messing around there. There was a strange problem with the video transmitters installed on previous Tinyhawks, where you would get a perfect picture through your goggles, but the footage recorded to the DVR would have a lot of breakup on it. And what was even stranger is that the problem didn't occur outdoors at all, and it was also fine flying around my house. But at the indoor sports hall, it was shockingly bad, and I once met up with NJ Tech at a highway service station, and I did an epic flight which I had to bin because the DVR footage came back so bad it was unusable. So it seems like the size of the room somehow affected the DVR recording in some way, but not what I was seeing through the goggles. Now, when I switched to the rapid fire module, the DVR recorded fine, and they say they have fixed this issue with this new VTX, but I can't confirm that because the sports hall is closed until after Christmas, so I'll have to do a separate video for that. The model comes packaged in the usual hard case. You are given a spare set of props, a mini screwdriver with a bunch of spare screws, soft mounts and some rubber bands. The charger is the same one that is supplied with the Tinyhawk S and can charge a 1 and 2S LiPo with a balance port for 2S, and you can switch between a high volt and the usual 4.2 volts. I always recommend not charging to a high volt because your LiPos will last longer. But with the higher kV of these motors and the expected voltage sag, I'm going to try both LiPos charged to a high volt. You're given a spare PH2 connector, and I've attached it to this test clamp with an XT30 on the end so that I can charge the 2S LiPo with a hobby grade charger, as there's no documentation detailing the charge current of the supplied charger. And it goes dark by 3 PM this time of year in the UK, so I don't have much time to mess around. The manual could do with some work. As I say, there are a few discrepancies which I have pointed out. Okay, let's check out the power on 1S. This is charged to a high volt, which I wouldn't normally do. But let's go for a punch out. So it should have plenty of power to do acro indoors, and also on a calm day like today. And it is flying great, smooth as anything. Look at that, just on 1S, amazing. It is really early here though, and the wind is due to pick up, so that's why I've come out early, just to show that you can fly these things outdoors, even on 1S, quite nicely. In fact, it's probably going to fly nicer on 1S than 2S with this connector, but we shall have to see. One last punch out. Shouldn't get as much voltage sag on 1S as 2S. Look at that. No problems at all. I didn't quite give it enough throttle for the recovery there, but no problems doing rolls and backflips and loops and things, and not getting any yaw washout, which is good news. Okay, let's check out the performance on 2S. So this is also charged to a high volt, And I'm going to flick it into angle mode because we're still in acro there. Let's check out the punch out this time. Well, it's making a lot more noise for sure. And there's a little bit more power there, but not as much as you would expect. And I imagine there's a ton of voltage sag going on. Can't hear any RPM drop, but I reckon we're gonna see it, because that's what happened with the Tinyhawk S on 2S. But back into acro mode, and of course it automatically flips into profile 2 for 2S, which is really nice. Means that you don't have to mess around changing that. Does not change the rate profile though, you have to do that manually through the on-screen display. But I'm not using stock rates because they're designed for a beginner and you would not be able to roll like that. And also I think in angle mode, I think if you just had a light breeze, I think you would struggle to not have it fly away with the stock angle limit. And you might struggle to do rolls and stuff like that in acro without crashing with the stock rates. But yeah, can't deny that it's flying nice, not hearing any oscillations with 1 or 2S, which is to be expected from EMAX. Oh, I'm already feeling the throttle dying on me though, which isn't good. Doesn't feel like I've been flying for too long. Right, yeah. Better bring it in for a landing before I kill this battery. Just flick it back into angle mode, see if I've got any drift issues. It's only drifting in the direction of the wind, so yeah. It's quite important for a model like this that there's no noise getting to the flight controller and we don't get significant drift, because when you're flying indoors you need that precision. Anyways, let's bring it in for a landing. This first bit of DVR footage was recorded using the provided 2S LiPo, and as you can see the voltage drops almost instantly into the 6s, and on a punch out I'm seeing 4 volts, so yeah, this LiPo is going to be toast after just a couple of flights like this. Ideally you want to be landing a 2S LiPo at about 6.7 volts, but we are already there. As it was early in the morning, the sun was still rising and I could see some jello through the goggles, but it's not shown up in the DVR due to the low bit rate of the DVR, so in sunny conditions you are going to get jello through to your video feed with this camera. What did impress me was the range. So all of the Tinyhawks released so far have had poor range from the built-in receivers, and this one is giving a decent RSSI value at 120 meters, which I'm glad, because otherwise the higher power output from the VTX would otherwise be wasted. The video feed is squeaky clean and the camera is performing nicely. I'm getting some buffeting on high throttle, but I can put that down to the wind picking up and the frame being quite flexible. But in general, the Tinyhawks aren't really for flying outdoors, and 2S isn't working with this connector. So I think this is EMAX giving a 2S option for the people who asked for a 2S Tinyhawk. And you will have to do some modding if you want to have that, but for me personally, I'll be sticking to 1S and flying it indoors where it's in its element, because the flight time on 2S was 2 minutes 26 and I couldn't even make it back to my landing pad. It literally ended up falling out of the sky. After this flight, I flew it outdoors on a 1S and it felt much more comfortable with less voltage sag, and I was still able to do acro, but I think the flight time is shorter than the Tinyhawk S, so that one is still a contender for sure unless they discontinue it for this one. It flew outdoors for just over 3 minutes, but that was taking the LiPo down to its limit. And after this flight, I took it into the house and it flew for 4 minutes until the battery completely died. Whereas the Tinyhawk S flew for 5 minutes with the LiPo not even charged to a high volt. I did wonder if setting the VTX to a higher power output had anything to do with the shorter flight times, but it didn't make a difference, so it must be down to the extra weight and slightly higher kV motors. Either way, despite its shortcomings, it was an absolute blast to fly indoors, so it's one I would recommend for sure, but keep it on 1S. I'll put a link in the video description if you wish to buy one, and this video has taken the best part of a week to put together, so if you found it useful and can afford to do so, I'll also put a link to my Patreon in the video description because I really need the help. And I just want to thank all of my Patreons for signing up this year. I couldn't do this without you, and it's getting ever increasingly harder to do this full time. So I'll leave you with some flying. I hope you all have a great Christmas. And as always, thanks so much for watching. Please continue to subscribe. Cheers.
Every day we escape, losing